All right, I
All
think
right.
we'll go ahead and get started.
Yeah, I think you're right. Go ahead, Aviva.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to today's presentation of responding to child abuse during a pandemic with Victor Vieth. He is with Zero Abuse Project. And we're excited to have you back again today, Victor. I wanted to go through a couple of housekeeping items today. My name is Aviva Lear, and I'm the Director of Development with Safe Passage for Children of Minnesota. Our two other staff are on the line as well. If you have any questions during the presentation for our staff or just in general, please go ahead and put that in the chat, and Stephanie McCorkle will be happy to help you as well. We are going to have a presentation today, and then we will have a time for question and answers. Again, the chat is a place where you can ask your question if it comes up during the presentation, or if you'd like to wait during the question and answer time, you can do that as well. Or there's another option during that time as well that you can unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question and then remute yourself as well. So we can turn on that feature at that time. You shouldn't need to share your screen today. Only Victor will be doing that as our host. And just want to make sure that everyone is also aware that this is being recorded. So it will be on our website at a later time as well. Lastly, if you have any distractions in the room that you're in, please feel free to turn your camera off during that time, and then you can turn it back on if you'd like to when the distractions are complete. Otherwise, feel free to show us yourself if you'd like to use your camera, but feel free to turn your camera off if that's more comfortable for you as well. So I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Rich, and he'll introduce our guest today.
Thanks, Aviva. And some of you have met Victor before. We had an earlier webinar. You may have met him in other places. But just a little bit about Victor. He is the Director of Education and Research for the Zero Abuse Project, which is now a part of the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. And historically, in his work as a prosecutor here in Minnesota, he recognized the need for quality training for child welfare workers. And he went to Washington and started a groundbreaking undergraduate program for social workers. He set up a program at Winona State, which gave workers a minor and the workers and the skills to work in child protection. And currently, the Zero Abuse Project, his project now trains annually over 30,000 workers and other first responders. Victor was just sharing that they're in 30 to 35 states each year, plus presenting at a number of conferences. They have a training module called Child First Forensic Response, which is in 22 states, and CAST, which I think he'll tell you a little bit about, CAST, in 28 states and 85 colleges and universities. So a very expanded reach. Victor will probably share a little bit again about his training, but is also, he and his staff put together 25 tips for multidisciplinary teams on dealing with COVID-19. And this is the third of 3 in our series on COVID-19 and how to address the fact that most states are estimating 50% of children who normally would be reported to child protection aren't being reported because the mandated reporters don't see them. So that's what he will talk about. I just also want to mention that coming up, we have one more webinar for 2020. It's in 3 weeks because of the Thanksgiving holiday, not 2 weeks. So that'd be December 2nd. And Julie Shordahl, who's the Executive Director of St. David's Center for Child and Family Development, and several of her staff will talk about the services they are providing. This is a really highly regarded direct service agency. If you kind of made a list of the programs and services that you really would want to have available to people at a high quality who are in the child protection or foster care system, this is the agency you would go to. They've got just a wonderful reputation. And so we're looking forward to that. And then we'll start back up again in January. And our first presentation will be a preview of the 2021 state legislative session, which the session starts on January 5th, I believe. And then this first webinar will be on January 13th. We want to encourage you to email us with any ideas you have about things that you would like to see in our webinar series, because we're populating the map or the calendar for 2021 as we go. So that's something to look forward to. And with that, let me just turn it over, Victor, to you and just say, thank you very much for all the work that you do and also for doing these 2 webinars for us this year.
You're welcome. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Aviva. My gratitude to Safe Passage for all you do, and honored to be with you this afternoon. As Rich mentioned, I've been in the field for a long time, 33 years and counting. I was a prosecutor in Minnesota for a decade. Then I went to the National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse, and then eventually under a federal award, I came back home and working with Winona State designed the Child Advocacy Studies curriculum that Rich referenced. We're also currently operating under a 3-year grant from the Department of Justice to provide training, technical assistance, publications to child abuse prosecutors and investigators. So our hand is in a lot of pies, and we work across the country, and that gives us a really good bird's eye view of the pandemic and the challenges that frontline child protection professionals are facing. So this afternoon, I'd like to chat with you a little bit about some of the factors that are likely contributing to an increase in child abuse during the pandemic, and we'll offer some recommendations based on a paper I co-authored that had 25 tips. We won't go through each of those, but we'll chat briefly about 14 suggestions, and I'll try to share with you a number of resources that may be of assistance to you in your respective work. And then hopefully we'll have a good 15 minutes or more for some questions. As I mentioned, this presentation is based on this article that I co-authored with colleagues from the Zero Abuse Project, where we chatted about different things that multidisciplinary teams could do to try to get a handle on the likely increase in maltreatment during the pandemic. In terms of the increase, there's significant anecdotal evidence across the country. Hospitals are reporting more egregious injuries. As Rich mentioned, there is a noticeable decline in mandated reports, and just a number of general indicators that the field is reporting. So some of the concerns for a rise in child abuse include the following. Most abuse is in the family unit. The National Incident Study says 100% of child neglect cases, more than 90% of physical abuse and emotional abuse cases are within the immediate family unit. And even in instances of sexual abuse, 60% of the time, the offender is already in the immediate family unit. So most offenders are already with children, and now because of the pandemic, they may be confined in the same close quarters for up to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that gives more opportunity to offend. As Rich mentioned, victims have less contact with mandated reporters. They may not be going to school at all in a traditional setting and just intersecting with educators via a virtual platform for limited hours. They're not intersecting with their friends. They're not going to gymnastics and swimming and baseball and other athletic programs. They're going to the doctor less often. So they're not intersecting with mandated reporters to the same extent that they had been doing before the pandemic. A number of indicators that online predators are more active during the pandemic. There's been in some communities an explosion of cyber tip line reports that tells us that would-be sex offenders are taking advantage of the kids having more time at home on their computers and trying to solicit them for sexual purposes. And as a general overview, child protection services are declining. We're still engaged, we're still an essential service, but declining in at least some communities. And in some communities, for a period of time, they shut down altogether. There was a children's advocacy center out east, for example, that completely closed their doors for a period of time. Well, a lot of that research is anecdotal, and in the decades to come, no doubt there'll be some hard peer-reviewed research that will give us a better sense of the likely increase in child abuse during the pandemic. But there already is one peer-reviewed study that is in press, and you see it on the screen, to be published in the Journal of Child Abuse and Neglect. And these researchers documented that among families where one or more of the caregivers has lost a job as a result of the pandemic, that added stress has increased emotional abuse, more swearing at children and things of that nature, and has increased physical abuse as well. The good news, though, is this same study found that if we can help parents reframe, re-understand their own interpretation of a loss of job or other stressors. So, for example, you lose your job and you're worried about that, but we can reframe that to say, well, now there's opportunities to maybe pursue the job you've always wanted, or to pursue that added education. The helping parents reframe their interpretation of the stressful event seems to have an effect on lowering the incidence of maltreatment. So, armed with that knowledge, anecdotal, and some research, what is it that we can do during the pandemic proactively? Well, it may be that fewer mandated reports are coming in, but that doesn't mean that teachers and doctors and nurses and faith leaders are no longer mandated reporters. So we need to reach out to them proactively and say, you are still on the job. We are still counting on you to pay attention to the families and children that you may still be intersecting with. Okay, you're a teacher, so you're not seeing the child in person 8:30 to 3:30 every day, but you are likely still having some virtual connections with that child. And so you're still seeing perhaps the upper torso of the body. And what might you see in terms of indications of physical abuse on the upper torso? You might see a mark around the neck, which would be indicative of choking or even torture. You may see, as a child turns their head, a little blood mark in or behind the ear, which is a telltale sign of physical abuse as you pull a child across the room. You might see a pocket of missing hair. You might see a handprint. You might see a blackened eye. There's still things you might pick up on. Pay attention to the environment that the child is in. Do you hear yelling in the background? Even if shouting doesn't rise to the level where a government would screen it in, it may still be an opportunity for you as educators to recognize potential stresses and get good resources into the home of the family that may be of concern. We can reach out proactively to teachers and faith leaders and others to still be alert for signs of maltreatment. And in terms of resources that we could use, our teachers and others as a conduit to get into the hands of families, there's a wealth, a plethora of free resources out there. The World Health Organization has published numerous free online resources, one of which you see on the screen for moms and dads. How do you cope with stress? How do you help your children cope with stress? We can, through social media platforms and the like, get that into the hands of families. Vanderbilt Hospital in Tennessee has a handful of videos that they had produced before the pandemic, but maybe even more helpful during the pandemic, given the rise in child physical abuse. For example, they have a very short but evidence-based, rooted in research video in multiple languages about how do you discipline your children without hitting them? How do you get your children to play nicely and not be aggressive with one another without you yourself resorting to violence? Parents under added stress may be more amenable to watching a video like that, especially since they are home and on their own laptops more often. 900 plus accredited children's advocacy centers in the United States. Some of the best are in our home state of Minnesota. Many CACs, long before the pandemic, had prevention specialists whose job it was to reach out into the community and launch prevention initiatives. Work with your children's advocacy centers. They're probably already on board, realizing, hey, prevention should not work during the pandemic. It should be accelerated during the pandemic. Maybe good programs they have could now be turned into a virtual platform, for instance. 37 states, including Minnesota, say that educators by law are required to provide personal safety and other prevention programming to youth. I'll bet you in a lot of schools in Minnesota that work stopped during the pandemic. It was among the first things to go away. Well, we need to remind the schools we have contact that they are still obligated by law to provide that prevention training. And maybe we can help them turn that into a virtual platform in collaboration perhaps with our children's advocacy centers. Here's a good free resource you could put in the hands of educators or faith leaders or others intersecting with families tomorrow. SHIELD is a task force in West Virginia of a wide variety of multidisciplinary professionals, and they very quickly produced a series of prevention videos for youth, and they tailor it for the stressors youth are experiencing during the pandemic. And you see on the screen, different videos are tailored to different ages. We could help spread the word about these really high quality resources that are online, absolutely free. We just have to get the word out. I am currently board chair of the Academy on Violence and Abuse, an international think tank of medical professionals. And on our website, we have a section on resources for professionals to utilize in working with families during the COVID-19 pandemic. avahealth.org is the website, avahealth.org. Check it out. Look at those resources. They are constantly being updated. Dr. Michelle Madsen Thompson from the University of Florida is one of the nation's foremost experts on instilling resiliency in children who have experienced one or more forms of trauma. And she very quickly began to develop resources during the pandemic that families could utilize. Every week, she had a one-pager, and you see a couple of them on the screen, that are designed for young children, and that moms or dads could read and work with young children on to build resiliency, to help them cope with their anxieties during this worldwide health crises. A second thing we can do is to realize we have new stakeholders that we didn't utilize in the past. We have folks that are delivering more goods and services into homes. We have grocers and others that are becoming more important in recognizing abuse than perhaps our traditional mandated reporters. So what can we do to educate, say, those grocery store clerks to recognize instances of potential maltreatment? Here is a simple chart that was developed by 6 board-certified pediatric specialists, and it was designed for laypersons to have a quick resource, a quick tool in identifying potential signs of child physical abuse. So let me walk you through the graphic for just a moment. Physically abused children are often punched in their stomachs. So you see injuries in that region of the body. When a little boy or a girl is being whipped with a stick or a belt, they often curl up in a ball. So the stick or belt is hitting their forearm or the side of their legs, and you see injuries to that portion of the body. Little boy, little girls being whipped, and they put out their hands as a defense mechanism. So they get some cuts or some blood marks on their hand. That would be indicative of potential child physical abuse. Parent slaps the child on the face, and the hand, 2 or 3 fingers or linear lines are imprinted on the face. That is a telltale sign of physical abuse. Children who are tortured, nearly 100% of torture cases involve tying up the child. So you bind the ankles, bind the wrists, and in some instances put a rope or other tie device around the neck of the child. So injuries in those 3 locations are telltale signs of physical abuse, likely torture. They're depicting below the buttocks bite marks. That would be indicative of abuse. Above the buttocks, they're depicting a patterned injury. You strike the child hard enough with an object that is imprinted on the body. Many children are shaken, and so injuries or complaints of injuries to the neck can be suspicious as well. And most parents who utilize corporal punishment strike the buttocks of the child, and any injury resulting there is often indicative of maltreatment as well. That for some is too garish, and so some have taken that design and put it in a less garish posture. The book Child Safeguarding Policy Guide by my friends Bazile Chivijan and Dr. Shira Berkovitz took that same guide, and as you can see, took the same information but made it a little less graphic. However you do it with your artists, we can put things like that into the hands of our mandated reporters and our grocery clerks and others who are now on the front lines. Here are two free resources that you could download this afternoon if you choose to. The Children's Hospital in Kansas City has designed two absolutely free apps. One is for medical professionals to help them sort through potential indicators of maltreatment, and the other app is for first responders, law enforcement, and others that may be intersecting with families. Well, that second app might also be appropriate for grocery clerks. They would quickly be able to realize things like, gosh, if the baby can't cruise, if they can't crawl yet, if they can't cruise, they shouldn't bruise. So if I got an infant coming through with mom or dad in my grocery store line and I see a lot of injuries on the child's body, that developmentally really shouldn't be happening yet. So things like that are available as resources that we perhaps could take advantage of. Child Protection and others on the MDT need to be very proactive during the pandemic. Make a good list of all the families you're intersecting with. Who do you already have child protection files on, or who may be under the care of a probation officer or a school resource officer. Check up on those folks. Whose responsibility is it to check on these families that may be at higher risk for maltreatment during the pandemic? If you're a prosecutor, work with courts to continue at least remote contact with children who are involved in CPS or delinquency proceedings or drug courts or whatever the legal action may be. I advise prosecutors to accelerate court preparation. You may have a child abuse trial scheduled several months from now, and normally you wouldn't already be preparing the child for court, but now maybe check on the child. She or he may have added anxieties. Gosh, is this going to be a virtual trial? Is everybody going to be watching me on TV? Is it going to be recorded? And could you put it on YouTube? There may be added stressors the child is facing. There may be an offender who's been removed from the home, but now has figured out a way to warm back in the child's life, taking advantage of the pandemic. We don't know until we ask, and so I encourage prosecutors to be asking. For CPS workers, we're going to have to adjust our case and safety plans during the pandemic. It may be as simple as saying to the child under the safety plan, what do you do if you feel unsafe? Well, normally maybe the child runs to grandpa's house a couple blocks away. Well, if you can't run to grandpa's house anymore, what are your other options? What can you do? I don't believe that safety checks should be scrapped during the pandemic. Some services are essential, and child protection is essential, and safety checks are essential. We have to do it as safely as we can with social distancing and PPE. Maybe we can think creatively. Maybe I've got multiple agencies going in the home, and maybe one agency can help the others in terms of a safety check. If it really is too dangerous to go into the home, somebody's been diagnosed with COVID, well, we could have a parent or someone else walk around the house with a laptop to make sure that food and other necessities are still in play. If there is an upside to the pandemic, what I see across the country is children's advocacy centers and therapists who were reluctant to use telemental health have now been forced to do it and are finding it may be of great advantage. It allows them to see more children in a day. It allows them also to get a sense of the child's world as they intersect with the child from his or her own home. But we do need to make some adjustments. We need to have a backup plan if the technology goes down and a child's in the midst of an outcry or suicidal ideation. So we do have to think through some technological challenges. Concerns about confidentiality if you're speaking to a child and a parent may be nearby, and there's added issues of insurance and the like that need to be sorted through as well. Boy, you can see how old this graphic is with only 25,000 deaths. It seems like it was a very long time ago, and now the pandemic has accelerated to ungodly levels. But we need to balance the risks of COVID with the risk of abuse. Both are deeply concerning. So we are essential service providers. We have to continue that work, but we have to be as safe as possible and balance the risks that we take with the risks a child may face. This is from the Minnesota Department of Health and Human Services. This was written before the pandemic. All these questions that help us determine a potential risk of abuse, we should still be asking these questions during the pandemic, probably even a greater urgency. The National Children's Alliance accredits the 900 plus CACs in the United States, and to their credit, NCA on a dime quickly began to develop resources for CACs and MDTs across the country. Some of the articles we've written have been added to the resources on their website. And one of the things our center has done, we're the leading trainer of forensic interviewers in the United States. We have 22 state programs, and about 60% of CACs have utilized one of our training initiatives. Well, we had to work with CACs. How do you make these adjustments during the pandemic for conducting traditional forensic interviews? Most CACs that I intersect with are still doing in-person forensic interviews, but with adjustments. The interviewer and the child is wearing a mask. On the screen is Dr. Allison Foster, a forensic interviewer in South Carolina. That's the mask she wears when she interviews children. The CACs do a health screening before the family comes to the CAC, and then when the family arrives, we try to add distance in the interview room. We spend more time developing rapport or relationship with the child before we get to the heart of whatever the presenting problem is. We're going to have to make allowances for extra time before and after the interview to make sure the room and the interview tools are cleaned. And in some instances, we may wish to employ remote observation where the interviewer and the child are in different rooms or even different buildings. Teleforensic interviewing, though, is very sparingly used with younger kids because they just can't fully grasp the technology. And there are added issues of potential defense attacks if you do a teleforensic interview. But nonetheless, a pandemic era forensic interview with even these adjustments still, in my view, meets legal standards for admitting these forensic interviews into evidence. These are traditional standards that are used under residual exceptions to the hearsay rule to determine if the interview is reliable. And all these things should still be showing up in your recorded interview. Does the child have a knowledge of sexual activity, which is unusual for their developmental status? Are they describing the sexual act or other crime in a way a little boy or girl would? Are they able to give the sights, the smells, the sounds of the physical abusive episode? Does the child articulate? They know bad things could happen with their outcry. They could go to foster care. Somebody could get arrested. That's an indicator of reliability, and so on and so forth. All these things that we traditionally use in court to assess the reliability of the forensic interview, they should still be in play during the pandemic. Polyvictimization screening we have urged for some time, long before the pandemic, but now it is even more important. We know from research from the University of New Hampshire that 2/3 of abused kids are violated in at least 2 ways, and about 1/3 of abused kids are violated in 5 or more ways. So whatever the presenting problem is, say sexual abuse, before the forensic interview is complete, you must, consistent with best practice, also screen for the possibility of physical abuse and emotional abuse and neglect and witnessing domestic violence, because 2/3 of the time, it is just the tip of the iceberg. And if it is true that child abuse is on the rise during the pandemic, then the polyvictimization screen takes on even greater urgency. Work with churches and synagogues and temples and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and other youth serving organizations to say, hey, your youth serving organization prevention policies, yeah, we just got to make some adjustments during the pandemic. So you're not intersecting in person with the youth, but you're still intersecting perhaps virtually. So how do we make that as safe as possible? It can be okay if you're intersecting with children online. You need to copy your texts to their parents or to your principal or others. If you are teaching a virtual session, it should be recorded, and that should be available to your principal or others so they can double check later on to make sure nothing nefarious is going on. If you're a teacher and you have to instruct from, say, your home, you're not doing it in your bedroom, or if your bedroom is the only option, you're going to position the laptop in such a way the child would not see the more intimate parts of your home. Simple adjustments like that can serve the purpose of prevention. If it is true that online crimes are increasing, then we should be working with the media and educate moms and dads through news accounts what they can do to check on their children. And we should be teaching law enforcement and others not to relax their standard of monitoring convicted sex offenders. Some communities have done that, saying we don't have the resources anymore to check on these sex offenders. Well, if it's true cyber tip lines are on the rise, then we should not be relaxing those standards. We still should be intersecting with that population. We need to think creatively for working with rural communities. I love what New York has done, where they've developed mobile children's advocacy centers. So, okay, maybe we can't transport the child a couple hours anymore safely to the Children's Advocacy Center, but we can have a well-cleaned mobile unit come to the child and still interview and still intersect with that boy or girl. We've been preaching this, no pun intended, for a long time, but there is no body of research greater than this that has been so largely ignored by the field. 34 major studies saying more than half of maltreated children are impacted not only physically and emotionally, but also spiritually. I pray and I pray and I pray and I ask God to stop the abuse, but it keeps happening. So what does that say about God or me or both? Am I still a virgin in God's eyes? Inquiries such as this often come from the lips of maltreated children, and yet they are almost routinely ignored by both faith and child protection professionals. 2017, Tishelman and Fontes did this study documenting how often in forensic interviews with children and how often in therapy and investigations in child abuse, kids are raising these spiritual questions. And so this research study said we have to dramatically improve the knowledge of secular authorities on these dynamics. We have to dramatically improve the knowledge of faith leaders on these dynamics, and we have to teach medical and mental health and faith leaders to tag team, to work together when a child is impacted not only physically and emotionally, but also spiritually. A healthy sense of spirituality, according to a 2019 study from Southern Methodist University, may be the #1 factor of resiliency for maltreated children. We can't ignore such a large body of research and still say that we are current in the field. At least 4 children's advocacy centers have actually hired a full-time chaplain to work in their CAC. This is Reverend Carrie Netto. She used to be a pediatric chaplain, so already had great trauma-informed skills. She was then trained by our program through our chaplaincy training on working with maltreated children. And it's just an additional service in the CAC. Nobody's required to see the chaplain. Well, last year in the CAC in Greenville, South Carolina, 535 children or adults asked for the services of the chaplain. This study from Johns Hopkins found among survivors across the country, even survivors that never intersected with good medical or mental health care, if they simply were able to maintain a healthy sense of spirituality, it was the most significant buffer against the trauma. If you're interested in learning more about that, we offer a 2-day training called Keeping Faith. Because of the pandemic, we offer it virtually. The next offering is just a few weeks away, December 7 and 8. You can go to our website, zeroabuseproject.org, search the term Keeping Faith, and register you and your team or faith leaders that you intersect with. almost done. We also need to take care of ourselves during the pandemic. There are added stressors on we child protection professionals. We too can't get out and about. We too can't go to ball games or movies or other things we utilized in the past to reduce our stress. We're not seeing our friends as often as we had. Maybe we can't go to our religious institutions anymore because of the pandemic. So we're going to have to think creatively. Some creative things that some teams have done, they developed a buddy system. So you got another colleague you're assigned to, and they're assigned to you, and you're supposed to look out for each other's health. We develop little lists, and we say, okay, what are 5 things you've always wanted to do that you could still do, albeit during the pandemic? And then somebody's checking in on you to make sure you're doing those things to address your own stress levels. Utilizing chaplains, mental health professionals we intersect with, getting them engaged could be important. Having your board of directors write letters to all the child protection professionals saying to them, we know extra burdens are on you, and we're grateful. We're so grateful for all you're doing for children. Take care of yourself as well. I'm also on the board of directors of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. They too weekly are updating their section on COVID-19 resources. So check that out periodically, apsac.org, and that can give you additional tools. I love this quote from John F. Kennedy: in a crisis, be aware of the danger, but still recognize the opportunity. I mentioned telemental health seems to have been a really good opportunity that we're seizing upon. Expanding our frontline workers to include grocers and delivery people may be another new reform that we want to retain even after the pandemic. So think of things like that, things that we may want to keep in place even when the health crisis passes. Rich, that's a quick overview of some of the things we talked about in that paper. Got another 15 or 20 minutes though, and happy to answer any questions or chat with any of you about anything on this subject that you wish to raise.
Great. Well, thank you, Victor. That was wonderful. That was just, I got so much information from that. I'm going to, and not take up a lot of time, give other people a chance to talk, but could you just give a little quick description of community, children advocacy centers, because I'm not sure everybody's run into them.
Sure. The Children's Advocacy Center movement began in 1985. There was a prosecutor named Bud Kramer in Huntsville, Alabama, who noticed that when a child abuse report came into the system, well, social workers would talk to the child, and the police would talk to the child, and maybe a victim advocate at the prosecutor's office, and maybe the child has to go to 3 or 4 legal proceedings. And he said, that doesn't make any sense. So we should build a house, and all the professionals should come to the house, and it's a one-stop shop where the child can receive medical care and mental health care and forensic interviewing and court preparation. Everybody can come to the child and thereby reduce the stress for the boy or girl. And that concept spread. The Victims of Child Abuse Act provided funding. And so today there are over 900 children's advocacy centers in the United States. In Minnesota, we've got Corner House in the Twin Cities, Midwest Children's Resource Center in St. Paul, Duluth. First Witness is a CAC in my region. In Winona, Maddie's Place is a CAC. So we have a number of CACs in Minnesota that can be utilized as well.
Okay, thanks. Well, let me just open it. Everybody is interested. You may be having to unmute yourself. I can't see that. Yeah. So just unmute yourself if you have a question and toss it in there.
Hi, Victor, Lisa Hounsar. I'm wondering about truancy, and maybe that's not the right word, but a lot of kids who aren't showing up to school because it's online, which in the past may have gone through child protection of not attending school, but where is child protection with that? Obviously, it's a unique situation during COVID, and then are they actually checking things out as to why they're not in school?
Yeah, I mean it's a big country, so I think some are following up, some are not. There is clear research that truancy is a correlation to maltreatment, and is something that should be followed up upon. Some schools I've intersected with, some child protection agencies I've intersected with say, well, there's so many additional reasons why the child now may not be participating. I don't need to do a full-blown check on that. I disagree with that. It could still be an indicator. There's some stresses, some challenges going on in the family. Education is still a necessity, maybe even greater importance during the pandemic. And so schools and others should still be following up and say, you know, why aren't you coming to school, and what's going on, and what can we do to address your needs?
I just like to invite people to turn on their cameras if you are so inclined. Don't feel pressured, but we'd like to see you if you don't, you know, if that's okay. So, any other questions?
Yeah, can I ask?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, Mr. V. It's a question about the child sexual abuse. And we know that most of the predator are the direct family. And specifically about if a mother in a custody or in divorce report child sexual abuse happened at the dad house, she lose custody and the child by the system more victimized. How can you fix that? Because, you know, I am within a parent group and we really get advice from attorneys and from a parent advisor not to report child sexual abuse if you're in the middle of custody. And that jeopardizes the child's safety, to my opinion. I disagree with that. What's your response? How can you solve this?
Yeah, that is a national crisis and has been for some time. There is both anecdotal evidence and research documenting that judges have a bias against a mother in a divorce custody case if she raises the issue of sexual abuse by her ex-husband. And social services and law enforcement are less likely to investigate these cases. However, if they do investigate, if they do traditional work, they substantiate it at almost identical levels as they would if the abuse occurred outside the context of divorce custody. So how do we solve it? We can only solve it with education. This is why the child advocacy studies reform is so critical. We've got to catch future child protection professionals at the undergraduate and graduate level and educate them about this research and these dynamics. We also have to educate judges in the field. University of Illinois intersected with 2,241 child protection judges across the country, and nearly 50% of them had 0 minutes of education on child protection. And so not even the most basic things they knew, and so they were ripe to fall for myths such as divorce custody allegations and holding that against mothers. So we're going to have to educate lawyers, to educate judges. We're going to have to put more good peer-reviewed research into the hands of these tribunals that make these decisions. We're going to have to work with the media and get them to report these sort of challenges. A week or so ago, I talked to a reporter in another state who had this very issue undergoing. The evidence really, from what she shared with me, is overwhelming. The child was abused, and yet the whole system, including the family court, was breaking down. So we need the media to cover those sorts of abuses more, and then just, you know, continue to raise awareness of this. But you've hit on something that truly is a significant national crisis. I mentioned APSAC. On their website, they had a special issue of the APSAC Advisor on Parental Alienation Syndrome. So if you go to the APSAC website, look under their publications, that's a free resource, and it summarizes a lot of the literature on this topic, and that might be a good starting place of a document to put into the hands of judges and others who make these decisions.
So is there anything an individual can do if they're in that situation? Because, and I think you did a conference on intimate partner violence where, I can't remember the exact term, but it was a similar idea where if an intimate partner complained too much, then they became the problem parent was the basic idea. So it would be a parallel, phenomenon.
Yeah, well, we work with investigators, and that's something we do in part under our federal grant. So if there's any investigator, criminal justice professional, social service professional, forensic interviewer, they can contact us for free technical assistance, and we'll work with them and aid them in overcoming any of these challenges. We don't provide services to the divorce custody attorneys, but I've certainly talked to divorce custody attorneys and sent them resources and articles and gave them some talking points. So you can reach out to us as well, and I'll try to give you a good direction.
Mr. Vieth, not only if the mother accused the father, any household at the father's house, that included too. And even if there is no custody, even if after the custody dispute resolved, if that is shocking to me. And when I searched that, I find this Gardner's theory discussed and challenged for being not true for the last 2 decades. So, I mean, the education is there, the resource is there, but why is there resistance taking this information in?
Well, it's a failure of attorneys in not driving it home to judges, and a failure of judges, and a failure of the media to cover that. And so, we're going to have to be better advocates in courts of law. You're absolutely right. Gardner's work has been wrongly disputed. The resource I just referenced is the latest publication I'm aware of that wrongly disputes it. And so you can take that document and say to a judge, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, a national organization of the most prestigious doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists and legal professionals, all say this is bunk, Judge, and really drive home where is the evidence to support this schlock science on the other side. We're going to have to be better advocates. That's the only way this will change, one child at a time.
Mr. Vieth, I think it's not the judge's fault. I could not blame the judge on that. It is assistant, social workers, investigator, police, and the guardian ad litem board. The guardian was under the audit, and they issued a recommendation. Nothing had been done. I mean, social worker, we advocate for the training academy to train them to do a better job interviewing the children. They are not getting the advantage of that. So we feel like our effort for child advocacy is not.
Yeah, I hear you. I agree in part. It's not exclusively the judge's problem. It is the social worker and law enforcement and the county attorney's office and others. Everybody who intersects with the case who lets the child down, they all bear some of the responsibility. But a good proactive judge should be asking the right questions and insisting on the right evidence. So the court can play a significant role as well. And some judges do.
You mentioned the guardian ad litem program. What's happening with guardian ad litem's working and also with training? Are they not training during COVID, and are they going to get behind?
Well, yeah. I think almost overnight training has become virtual. We are a national training organization. Almost overnight, everything became virtual. So we're probably providing more training than in the past. And so I think for guardian ad litems and others, they probably had more opportunities to access training than they have in the past, not just through our organization, but others. But we train more investigators and prosecutors than we do guardians. But my guess is they've probably had more access to training than they have in the past in a virtual world.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you ever pay attention to parental maternal literacy skills as an adverse child experience?
Can you tell me more about that or give me an example?
Well, 70% of prison inmates are mostly illiterate. Mm-hmm. And this is often a problem of very little literacy training, reading with books and book experience and storytelling during the first 3 years of life. So I'm finding out as a retired pediatrician that I made a mistake in not paying attention to the literacy skills of the mother. Because very often this is multi-generational. There's this poor self-esteem that goes with that, school dropout, teen pregnancy failure, and on to child abuse. So I was curious if you ever hear people inquire about parental literacy skills as a potential adverse child experience.
I have not, but I think what you're saying makes perfect sense to me, and it would be part and parcel of a factor from a high ACE score, and then it sort of becomes this circle where one feeds into the other. That would make perfect sense to me. And if you have any literature on that, please send it to me, and I can take a lead and begin to incorporate that into the work we do.
I'll get Rich to help me out here.
Okay.
All right, yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
Connection.
Yeah. Then, thanks for raising that. Yeah.
It's Ron, like cross-sector stuff. Victor, you and I talked briefly before, everything started about, the intersection among animal abuse and domestic violence and child protection. So I just wonder if you had any kind of overall things to say about that.
Yeah, in some states, Ohio comes to mind. Veterinarians and others are now mandated child abuse reporters because of the research showing a correlation between animal abuse and child abuse. Very consistent with the polyvictimization research. When you see one form of abuse, you often see multiple forms. And I believe it is 60% of substantiated child abuse cases. There's also animal abuse that can be substantiated if you look for it as well. And so increasingly we're teaching folks where you see animal abuse to also look for child abuse and vice versa, because more often than not you'll find it. And I would also add that I increasingly see in forensic interviews, and we purposely in our program, we always ask about the animals in the home as well. And so we're just seeing a lot of anecdotal evidence where kids will say, yeah, dad said if I tell about the sexual abuse or whatever the crime is, the cat goes in the microwave, the dog is forced to sleep outside in the winter, the dog gets kicked, whatever it may be. And that is a dynamic that offenders sometimes use to keep the victim quiet. So it is a good inquiry to make. Feel free if you have other questions. This is one of the very few times you can ask a lawyer a question and not get a bill. So feel free to pose a question.
Well, wait a minute.
What are you seeing about rates of mortality of children since COVID started?
I haven't seen data. And I think a lot of data from the pandemic, it'll be 10, 20 years from now that we fully sort through all of that. But, we know if you got an ACE score of 6 or higher, you're going to die 20 years younger on average than you would otherwise. And so if child abuse is going up, I would think that long-term mortality is going to go up as well. And we certainly are seeing anecdotal evidence that hospitals are saying, I'm seeing more egregious injuries, which probably leads to more deaths as well. So logically, I'd assume it's going up, but I haven't seen hard data to confirm that.
You can't see Lisa, but she was a member of the Governor's Child Protection Task Force and has been a major part of our work the last 5 years. But just going back to something Mervat mentioned, just kind of the institutional resistance to, looking at new data or training people to do something new. That's really the heart of your mission is to kind of overcome that. But, just as an example, with your help and the previous two webinar presenters, we put together kind of a list of resources for the state, for the Department of Education and Human Services and the Children's Cabinet. And I said, hey, here's some things that we could be doing, and, can we talk about it? And, essentially the response was, oh, we've got that covered. We're already doing all that, but we, don't have time to share that all, and kind of end of conversation. So So part of our, ongoing, challenge is to just keep pushing at that. And, what Mervat was saying brought to mind that there was a child who was, murdered in August of this year here, Autumn Hallow, who had been starved to death over a period of 6 months and also beaten and strangled, and eventually was strangled to death. And just a bunch of horrible things. And the courts, the mom was just running from one person to another saying, help me, I know something's going wrong. They haven't given me access. And they just told the court, well, it was not a child protection case, although the brother had one, but they told the court, well, we're concerned because of COVID, so we don't want anybody to see the child. So 6 months, nobody in school seeing the child, nobody. And the institutions, all the courts said, well, she didn't file the proper papers, and child protection said, well, the case was with the brother. Law enforcement went to the home, and they didn't actually go in. And so the father said, well, we're concerned about COVID, and so he had the girl come to the door and wave at the police, and that was good enough. And the child was, slowly tortured to death. So that's just an example of institutions kind of not stepping up and, just thinking about that situation, and also not working across organizational lines.
I would add to that. I mean, for 40 years, the National Incident Study, the most prestigious collection of data our federal government does, for 40 years has said the more egregious a case of child abuse is, the more likely it is to be screened out and not properly assessed. And you mentioned torture. Dr. Barbara Knox co-authored pioneering research on child torture and found that virtually all child torture cases were involving multiple reports into the system, and multiple times they were screened out or not properly assessed. So it's just telltale evidence. The more egregious the case is, the less likely it is to be screened in. That isn't going to change until we dramatically reform undergraduate and graduate training of not only social workers, but criminal justice professionals and lawyers and faith leaders and the like. And that is the importance of the child advocacy studies reform we began back in 2003. That's now spread to 28 states and counting, and there's 8 peer-reviewed published studies showing that reform dramatically improves the skills of frontline professionals. And we're working with Senator Tina Smith to try to get federal funding to expand that reform. And if you've got connections to policymakers, send me an email and I'll tell you what you can do to encourage them to move in that direction.
That's great. So, but it seems counterintuitive that the worse the situation, the less likely to get screened in. Can you say why you think that might be?
Sure. Well, in cases of torture, it is often such a bizarre story. A child saying, I'm chained in the cellar, there's bars on the wall, or the like. And because of the egregious misconduct, the child may have all sorts of mental health issues. And so child runs away, and parents say, oh, the child is severely disturbed, and so of course we try to lock them in at night because they're always running away. And if you're just a really good deceiver, it's very easy to fool medical or other professionals who are only going to spend a few minutes with you anyway. And it's just easy. In Wisconsin years ago, there's a case of child torture where siblings were saying, oh yeah, we got a sister, she's chained in the cellar and she's got a shock collar, and we shoot her with pellet guns. And it was just so bizarre, the educators couldn't believe it. And when reports came in, it was so bizarre that folks decided, oh, that's just a silly thing, we don't want to waste time on that. And again, it's the sort of thing that without education, it's probably always going to fall through the cracks.
So talking to the
question. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, Greg, why don't you jump? Greg is a member of the board and a retired child protection supervisor in Kennesaw County.
Hey, thanks for what you do.
Most of my work when I was working was at Hennepin County, which is a very large county. And my question kind of goes to that, in my experience, a lot of the larger court systems in particular had difficulty meeting timelines, and both in state legislation and federal legislation, there are judicial guidelines that have to be met to move the child protection case through the system supposedly in a timely manner. what I'm wondering is if you're seeing anything with the COVID situation that is creating further delays in the judicial movement of cases through the child protection system.
Yeah, I'm hearing across the country significant delays in court, that we've been suspending court hearings or moving them off as far as we can, and so that can add to the burdens as well. And you know, you're raising a whole host of other issues too. I mean, the problem gets bigger and bigger the more we talk about it. But you know, there are national guidelines for how many cases a social worker should have, and I don't know what it is in Hennepin County, but a number of studies have said your average social worker is way above what would be normal guidelines. And so, you know, even if you are well trained, you often don't have the time to fully explore what may be going on in a family. And so there's just multiple layers here to sort through. Rich, I'm going to have to go pretty soon. I've got another meeting that's starting.
Can I just ask you one more question? Can you just say again what the reform is that you're working on with Tina Smith? Because I was distracted doing something else and I missed some of that.
Sure. We're trying to get federal funding for universities and colleges so they have some resources to implement undergraduate and graduate reforms or our child studies, child advocacy studies initiatives. So she's been working for more than a year with us to see, gosh, you know, is there some legislation moving where we could stick in an amendment, or is there a way to encourage a federal agency to issue a grant program? So she's been a great support to us on that potential front.
Sorry, I missed that. We probably got to let you go, or do you have time for one more question?
I can probably take one more, but then I need to run.
Jump back in again.
I just have a quick question. Do you do any consulting with those that do training for foster parents? Just asking, as a foster parent, I feel like that's an area that has been missed a little bit during COVID. And as we are having kids in our homes, returning to homes that, you know, are still going through all the stress that we're going through, and the abuse is happening, sometimes we're the only ones that are noticing, as social workers aren't going into homes right now. Sometimes guardian ad litems aren't going in the home. It's all virtual. So just curious of if you do any consulting with that, or is there somebody else that kind of does that training, that, you know, you talk about education to kind of educate foster parents a little bit more concerning some of the things you talked about to look for as far as physical abuse.
Yeah, I mean, depending on what the training is, we might or might not be able to do it. But Pete Singer from Care in Action in the Twin Cities, he's a really great trainer, and he'd be a really great resource. He's got a background in social work and mental health work, and he works with a lot of schools on trauma-informed care, and I know he's worked with a lot of parents with really difficult challenges. So he'd be one person I might make a referral to for training.
Awesome, thanks.
Sure. Okay.
I'll let you go.
All right.
Thank you again. It was great. And we'll, you know, again, this is a recording, so we'll post it on our website if people want to go back to it.
All right. Thanks, Rich. Thanks, everybody, for all you do for children. I'm grateful for everything. Take care.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.